My pick for Album of the Month in March is the new album Promises, which features the London Symphony Orchestra, Pharoah Sanders, and Floating Points, the electronic musician. On paper, it seems that these three have nothing to do with each other, you know? Pharoah Sanders being one of the most legendary jazz musicians that is still alive today, and whose catalog dates all the way back to the 1960s, and the London Symphony Orchestra, whose classical compositions have withstood the test of time and contributed to many great film scores, especially the Star Wars film score. And then you have the newcomer of those three, Floating Points, a newer electronic musician who's only had their start for the past 6-ish years and has grown some level of notoriety in the indie community. But somehow, they magically made one of the best jazz albums to have been made in the past 20 years. Jazz, since the 1970s, has really had a tumultuous time of it, and has ultimately gone stagnant when a lot of its main players went and basically sold out. Miles Davis had moved on to making garbage albums like Tutu and whatever other crappy Michael Jackson covers he put out. Herbie Hancock basically just went the way of turned his jazz fusion into smooth garbage and eventually devolved into doing turntable music. But of those to not change course completely is Pharoah Sanders. Pharoah Sanders, throughout his entire career, has been consistently playing his improvisational and spiritual style of jazz, and even up to his last release back in 2014, has still had a fruitful career and has gone on to one of the last standing giants in the jazz world. But that problem is that giant has been kind of stuck in the same spot he's been in since the 70s. While he didn't sell out, he didn't evolve either. His music did not change, and that can be both a good thing and a bad. But in today's case, it is a good thing, because with that, we would have the current dynamic that this album centers on, and he's the main component that holds this thing together. Next would be Floating Points. Floating Points seems to have taken more of a producing role to this album. His presence really isn't known throughout the album, and only slight electronic interludes permeate throughout the songs, but they still add a little bit of emphasis to some of the notes that the symphony and Pharoah Sanders are playing. And what the notes ultimately culminate in, this fantastical and amazing soundscape that entirely relies on the opening phrase that begins each movement of the album, which in itself could be somewhat of a flaw of the album, because if you listen all the way through, that 4-note phrase could get a little irritating. But luckily, I think they build off of that enough through their improvisation and through their composition to build a cohesive soundscape. And while that is wonderful and their playing is wonderful, I think sometimes it comes at odds with one another. For the most part, this feels like a Pharoah Sanders project featuring Floating Points and the London Symphony Orchestra. And that may or may not have been the point. It definitely feels like it throughout the first half of the album, because while I think that it's beautiful and all, the improvisation of Pharoah Sanders does come at odds at times with the London Symphony Orchestra and with the 3 to 4 note phrase at the beginning, because it does repeat in some of the earlier tracks like Movement 3 and Movement 4. While that is true, I feel like the London Symphony Orchestra does get its chance to shine, especially on Movement 6, where it takes more the forefront and fill the soundscape as equally as well as Pharoah Sanders did. But maybe that's also a problem, because it feels like pulling one away just to fill it with another, and you can't have them mixed together as well at times. Even if those two things come at odds to each other, I still think this is an amazing jazz record, and an amazing classical record, ambient record, and electronic record. It manages to capture all of those things within its 47-minute runtime, and manages to be beautifully orchestrated and beautifully improvised, manages to carry on some of the things that Pharoah Sanders did in the 70s, and modernize it and update it to a newer audience while not alienating its older audience and creating something that feels uniquely its own and will likely stand the test of time, even among all of the massive discographies that come together to make it the masterpiece that it is. And I'm going to give this album a 8.6 out of 10.